G'day, grandiose imaginosa, writing and reading, talking about the writing. Now, first off, if you've watched the last couple of videos, Shankster was the name of the character, but in reality, her name is Sirund. It has been Sirund for a good year. I just used Shankster because I couldn't remember this character's name and I didn't want to spend the time going to find it. I wanted to write. So I just picked the name and started writing, even though I knew I was writing about her using the wrong name. This is the correct name, so here it is. Now, by the time the reader gets to this point in the book, there's a whole bunch of stuff they'll understand about the setting, which you, listening to this or reading what you can see on the screen there, won't understand. The Garden of Stone, this palace, is carved into a mountain, is a very, very old, 5,000 years old. It was created, it was occupied by an empire that lasted a couple of thousand years, and then that empire died. It was empty for a long time. It has only recently, we're now at this point about 7,000 years from the first dawn. It has only for a couple of hundred years now been occupied, and it's occupied by people species and groups of species who've had nowhere else safe to go. It's kind of the place of last resort. Excuse me. And the people who occupy it don't necessarily get along very well. Okay, so it's a very big and very old complex of hallways and rooms and kitchens and everything you could imagine in a palace on a scale that you probably can't imagine. And most of it isn't used by the current occupants. Sirund wanted an empty place. No voices, no eyes. No clamouring of strangers to stir up her own internal clamour. Sirund did not want to see herself in other eyes. She did not want to see what those other eyes saw. She did not want to be who those other eyes saw. Sirund wanted to be alone. Not be alone created by closing a door. She wanted an inescapable alone, one which could not be broken easily. She had searched the stone for such a place. She had found only two possibilities. Sirund could go out into the wilds, up the mountain slopes, or into the forests that edged the gardens of stone. Despite having survived her journey of escape, Sirund did not believe herself a match for the dangers and predators that the outside wilds contained. She did not seek death. She sought solitary emptiness, the opposite of what her life had been up to this day. It was common knowledge among the established inhabitants of Stone that the halls and passageways they lived in were a tiny part of what was carved into the mountain. The palace had been here roughly 5,000 years. It had been built in the age when the lesser gods walked and worked among mortals. The marks of such a god's power could be seen in the scale of the stone and the way the mountain had been bent to serve the will of the builders. The seeming endless vastness which had... Whoa. I need tea. Maybe that'll help. The seeming endless vastness which had been carved into the mountain provided Sirund with her second possible direction to find that inescapable aloneness. She had found 3 different places where the inhabited parts of the stone simply dribbled into emptiness and then into darkness. She had found 3 different places where the inhabited parts of the stone simply dribbled into emptiness and then into darkness. 2 were large passageways, major travel paths running from the front hub area of the palace out and back into the mountain. Both passageways had many smaller passages running off them, and many complexes of rooms and halls had been found along those smaller passageways and occupied by different species. Sentence is too long. Both passageways had no end. They simply came to a point where there were no more inhabitants in any side passages, and at that point, the major passages continued in darkness and silence. Sirund had considered them both. That picture needs to be made clearer. The big passage, the smaller passage, the big passage just keeps going into blackness. The third place she had found was a hall used by various groups for playing sports and games, particularly the game called Crush and Blood. It's not called that, but again, for now, that'll do. There is a game on Larnleaf which is played everywhere by everyone. It's the world game, if you like, and it's pretty violent. The occupied part of the hall was well lit, but even there it was unclear if you could see the roof or just thought you could. This massive hall had only 3 walls, where you might expect the 4th wall there was only a vast black space. The floor flowed smooth and even out into that blackness, as did both side walls. The light that glowed from the floor and walls faded away. When Sirund asked what was out there, she had been answered with shrugs. On that first day, she immediately started walking towards that empty blackness. None tried to stop her, but they watched her go with a low murmur of curious commentary. Sirund walked a good kilometre into that darkness. Again, the planet has its own measurement system. When I'm writing this, I'm not going to stop and go looking for that measurement system and work that out, because I might never come back and finish this. So I just used kilometre and kept going. Sirund walked a good kilometre into that darkness. The bystanders returned to their games and their noise level jumped. And then, as she continued to walk steadily into the darkness, the volume behind her diminished slowly. Eventually, she stopped and turned to look back. She could see them playing their games. Between her and them was blackness. They were tiny, but clear. She assumed they could also still see her in her pool of light which glowed unyielding against the dark without trying to overcome it. Looking back, the walls emerged from the darkness only close to that distant spot full of energy and movement. Where Sirund stood, she could see no walls, no roof, and no end to the blackness that she had walked towards. She let out a sigh and felt something in her loosen. Here was her emptiness. Here was her path. She would walk this way until she found what she was needing, or she found no further path available to her. The emptiness meant she needed to prepare. She heard no trickle of water from where she stood. Perhaps the unused parts of stone were dry. She would need to carry her own water and food, the water being the more important of the two. Now, readers of the book by this point will understand how things work on Llanweave, and one of the ways that things work is that in many places the buildings provide running water, drainage, hygiene services, and heating if it's needed. These are not built by the people. They're a function of the buildings. Even if the people build the buildings, then the buildings produce. Now that all implies a whole bunch of things about Llanweave. This process does not exist in every building, in every place, but in most. And those services, if we call them that, exist for as long as the space is occupied. All of that will be clear by the time the readers get to this point in the book. Or perhaps the water flowed in the walls of the hall. Sirund decided to return to the occupied areas to get her preparations settled. She did not walk directly back. She turned and walked towards where she believed there might be a wall. There was. And then it should probably say, she stood and listened for a while, and she heard the trickle of water she had hoped for. Off in the direction of the dark, she could hear water trickling, the same sound the drinking bowls made in the passageways and rooms all through the occupied places. She would need only food and a large water bladder for precaution's sake. Now, That's as far as I've written there, because that would come before what you've already heard about in the previous two videos, when she's actually out in the darkness, far away from everybody. And I wrote the bit before that. I've already written that bit, and I need to write the bit after that as she goes further out into the darkness. Though there's not a lot more to write about that. Now, this is one of those situations where, in terms of this book, I know the end of Sirun's journey. And I've written the end before lots of the rest of it has been written. But I know the outline of the rest of the journey. I'm not starting at the end in my head and then going to work out the rest. The end flows from the rest. I just only started writing this 4 days ago. There's a great deal that's in my head about the arc of various characters, which I haven't written down anywhere yet, and I need to. I have an encyclopedia. Don't know if I've mentioned that 7, 8, 9 months ago, but I have an encyclopedia. There's so much information. I've actually had to create an encyclopedia to keep track of everything that's come out of my head. Okay. So, that's good. And it was a good illustration of how reading something aloud is very useful for going, oh, that's not clear. That needs an extra phrase or an extra sentence or whatever. Because the writing, the first bit, kind of have to keep going. You can't just try and write the perfect first draft. There's not much point in having a first draft if you're trying to make it perfect. You need to write. You need to get meat on the page and then come back. Now, I don't know how ragged other people's first draft is. Mine can't be too ragged. I kind of need to tell the story. It kind of needs to make sense. I need to put enough on the page that if I come back and read it, I understand what I was trying to create. But it doesn't need perfection, far from it. And far as I can tell, by the time I finish this book, I'll probably have written it 4 or 5 times at least, because it's just writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting as you keep reading. Anyway, that's it. I'm Grandiose Imaginosa. I hope you're enjoying what you're reading or enjoying what you're writing. See you next time.